Welcome to my channel, The World of Science Fiction. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. The air in containment block Gamma was a recycled ghost, tasting of chilled metal and the faint, antiseptic tang of despair. Kalen felt it as a familiar pressure in his lungs, a weight that had settled there years ago and never truly left. He walked the polished ferro-concrete floors, his mag boots emitting a soft, rhythmic hum that was the only sound besides the distant thrum of the station's life support. His title was Warden, a designation that felt both grandiose and utterly hollow. He was a keeper of cages on a dead rock named Xylos, a final posting after a long, unremarkable career spent enforcing the hegemony's will on worlds that had never asked for it. Xylos was a scab on the face of the void, a planet stripped of its atmosphere and life by some forgotten cosmic cataclysm. It now served the hegemony as a high-security research and extraction facility. They mined exotic isotopes from its core and stored things in its belly that were too dangerous or too valuable for civilized space. Kalen's job was to ensure those things remained stored. He was a functionary, a cog in a machine he no longer believed in, motivated now only by the steady accumulation of credits that would one day buy him a quiet plot on a world with a real sun. His path was illuminated by sterile white light strips that ran along the junctions of wall and ceiling, casting no shadows and offering no warmth. He passed row upon row of reinforced containment cells, their meter-thick plasteel doors flush with the walls. Most were empty, their designation plates dark. Some held dormant technological artifacts or geological samples that pulsed with faint, contained energies. Kalen knew the inventory by heart, a litany of sterile numbers and classifications that meant nothing. He was disillusioned, a man worn smooth by duty, his cynicism a shield against the crushing pointlessness of it all. Tonight, his patrol route was different. A new directive had come down from Administrator Forlag himself, reassigning him to the deepest, most secure level of the facility. He was to take over watch duties for Containment Unit 7. The previous warden had been transferred off-world with a suddenness that suggested a breakdown, a failure of nerve. Kalen had heard the whispers. The asset in 7 was different. Not technology, not geology. It was alive. The elevator descended with a stomach-lurching silence, the pressure in his ears the only indication of movement. The air grew colder, heavier. This level was different. The walls were thicker, laced with energy-dampening filaments that shimmered like captive heat haze. The silence was absolute, a profound and unnerving stillness that seemed to absorb sound. There was only one cell on this level. Containment Unit 7. The door was a monstrous slab of alloyed tungsten, its surface scarred by forces Kalen could not imagine. A single observation window, a slit of tri-diamond laminate no wider than his hand, was set into the metal. Beside it, a complex console flickered with vital signs and energy readings that fluctuated in a chaotic, unpredictable rhythm. Warden Ostengrav was waiting for him, his face a mask of grim fatigue. Ostengrav was old guard, a man whose adherence to protocol was legendary. "Kalen," he said, his voice a low gravel. He did not offer a hand. "Forlag's orders. You're on the rotation now." Kalen nodded, his eyes fixed on the chaotic readouts. "What is it?" Asset 734. The official designation is non-terrestrial biological anomaly, the grunts who brought it and called it the Xylos heart. Ostengrav ran a hand over his tired face. "It's the reason this whole facility exists. The isotopes are a byproduct. The real mine is in there." Kalen stepped closer to the window. The interior of the cell was bathed in a dim, pulsing amber light. At its center, suspended in a web of crackling energy binders, was a creature that defied easy description. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but its form was fluid, seeming to shift and coalesce. Its skin, if it could be called that, was the color of deep space, shot through with veins of what looked like captured starlight. It had no discernible face, yet he felt an intelligence there, ancient and vast. It was female, the form suggested, a being of impossible grace held in a state of perpetual agony by the hegemony's machines. "What are we doing to it?" Kalen asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Extraction," Ostengrav said flatly. "It emits a unique energy signature when under duress. That energy is valuable. Forlag has found a way to weaponize it. The process is automated. Our job is to watch the numbers, to make sure it doesn't break. A klaxon, sharp and intrusive, blared once. On the console, a red light began to flash, labeled extraction cycle initiated inside the cell. The energy binders intensified, their crackle rising to a shriek. The creature convulsed, a silent scream of light and energy. The readouts on the console spiked into the red, showing a massive surge of power being siphoned away into the station's core. Kalen watched, his hands clenched into fists. He had seen countless horrors in his service, had become numb to violence and cruelty. But this was different. This was not a battle. It was a dissection, a slow, methodical butchering of something that felt less like a creature and more like a force of nature. He saw a flicker near the creature's base, a small, automated dispenser that dropped a gray, nutrient-rich pellet onto the floor. It was the only sustenance the asset received, a calculated measure to keep its biological functions stable enough for continued extraction. The pellet lay untouched. The creature was too consumed by pain to notice. The extraction cycle continued for a full minute, a minute that stretched into an eternity. When it finally ceased, the energy binders dimmed, and the creature slumped in their grasp, its inner light fading to a dull, wounded glow. Kalen felt a cold anger, a feeling so long dormant he had forgotten its texture. It was the ghost of the man he used to be, the one who had joined the hegemony believing in order and justice. He stood his watch for hours, the silence broken only by the hum of the console and the periodic, agonizing shriek of the extraction cycle. He watched the untouchable pellet of nutrient paste on the floor. It was a symbol of the hegemony's cold, calculated cruelty. They would keep it alive only to hurt it more. A thought, irrational and defiant, sparked in the barren landscape of his mind. It was a small thing, a meaningless gesture in the face of such overwhelming, systemic brutality. But it was his. He looked over his shoulder. Ostengrav was gone, his own shift ended. Kalen was alone with the machine and its victim. He leaned over the console. His clearance gave him access to the environmental and nutritional subsystems. It was a simple matter of a few commands, a minor rerouting of the dispenser tube. He tapped the controls, his fingers moving with a precision honed by years of military protocol. He wasn't breaking a seal. He wasn't opening a door. He was just moving a food pellet. A transgression so minor it would likely go unnoticed. He rerouted the dispenser to a point directly above the creature's main torso, bypassing the automated drop onto the floor. Then, overriding the timed release, he triggered a manual dispensation. Another gray pellet emerged, not falling to the floor, but landing softly upon the creature's shimmering form. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the pellet dissolved, absorbed into the creature's body not as food, but as something else. Information. Contact. A current of energy, gentle and questioning, flowed back through the dispenser's contact point, into the console, and into Kalen. It was not an attack. It was a touch. For a fraction of a second, his mind was filled with the scent of wet earth, the feeling of deep roots, the silent, slow consciousness of a world. And then all hell broke loose. The creature, Lyra, as his mind was suddenly supplied the name, surged with a power that had nothing to do with the pain of extraction. It was a tide of raw, untamed life. The energy binders shattered with reports like cannon fire. The console before Kalen exploded in a shower of sparks, throwing him back against the far wall. The tungsten door of Containment Unit 7 buckled outward, its locks screaming as they were torn from their moorings. A wave of pure, silent energy washed through the facility. Lights blew out. Systems failed. The oppressive hum of the station died, replaced by the rising shriek of emergency alarms and the panicked shouts of men. He had not just offered food. He had offered a connection. And in doing so, he had given a god back its thunder. The station plunged into a state of chaotic twilight, lit only by the strobing crimson of emergency beacons. The main power grid was dead, the silence of its absence more terrifying than any alarm. Kalen pushed himself up, his ears ringing from the console's explosion. Shards of crystalline data chips crunched under his boots. The monstrous door to Unit 7 hung ajar, twisted metal groaning in protest. From within the darkened cell, a soft, stellar light pulsed, a slow and steady heartbeat. He knew what this meant. An asset of this value, this power, Breaching containment was not a problem to be solved. It was a threat to be neutralized. Administrator Forlag would not send a capture team. He would send an extermination squad. And the warden on duty, the man whose console logs would show the final, unauthorized command, would be neutralized right along with it. His life, measured in hegemony credits and protocol, was now worthless. Footsteps, heavy and rhythmic, echoed from the elevator shaft. Mag boots on steel. A squad was coming. He heard the sharp, clipped voice of Subcommander Thorne, a man whose cruelty was matched only by his ambition. Seal the sector. Full combat loadout. The asset is to be terminated on sight. The warden too. No witnesses. Kalen's survival instincts, honed on a dozen battlefields, took over. His past was gone, his future a blank slate. There was only the next 10 seconds. He looked into the cell. The being, Lyra, was free of her bonds, floating in the center of the chamber. Her light was brighter now, calmer. She turned a featureless face toward him, and he felt not gratitude or anger, but a profound, ancient curiosity. She had saved her energy for this, a single, decisive act of liberation. He was trapped between Thorne's approaching fire team and a being of unimaginable power. His choice was simple. He could surrender and be executed for his transgression, or he could step through that broken door. He took the only path that offered a chance, however slim, of another sunrise. "Come on," he said, his voice hoarse. He did not know if she could understand words, but he gestured with his sidearm toward the service corridors at the far end of the hall. "This way. If we stay here, we die." Lyra drifted out of the cell, her movements as silent and fluid as smoke. She was taller than he had realized, her form resolving into a more stable, humanoid shape. She regarded Thorne's approaching soldiers, their helmet lights appearing as bobbing circles down the long corridor, and then looked back at Kalen. There was a flicker of understanding. She was powerful, but she was disoriented, weakened by cycles of endless torture. She did not know this metal maze. He did. They were a forced, unlikely alliance. A jaded warden and a living star, fleeing the wrath of the system that had imprisoned them both. He led her away from the main concourse, into the tight, labyrinthine service tunnels that were the station's guts. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and hot wiring. Emergency power was failing, casting the corridors in a flickering, unreliable light that made the shadows dance and writhe. Behind them, the hunt began. Thorne's voice echoed through the comms, now broadcasting on open channels in the chaos. Sector C-9 is our last known location. Flush them out. Use incendiary charges if you have to. Forlag wants the asset's corpse and the traitor's head. Kalen moved with grim purpose, his knowledge of the station's layout his only real weapon. He knew which conduits were wide enough to crawl through, which maintenance shafts led to the lower, forgotten levels of the original mining colony. Lyra followed without question, her soft light a beacon in the oppressive dark. She moved with an unnerving grace, her feet never seeming to touch the grated floor. She was a creature of open spaces, of deep earth and high sky, and this metal cage was as alien to her as she was to it. They reached a junction, a vertical shaft that dropped 20 meters to the old or processing level. The ladder was slick with leaking coolant. Kalen began to descend, his boots finding purchase on the cold rungs. He glanced up. Lyra simply floated down after him, her descent slow and controlled. She was a celestial body with its own gravity. As her feet touched the floor of the level below, the structure above them groaned. Thorne's men were using explosives. A section of the ceiling, weakened by the blast, gave way. A torrent of twisted metal and shattered rockcrete rained down, directly over Kalen. He had no time to react, only to brace himself for the impact. But it never came. He looked up to see Lyra standing over him, her arms raised. The falling debris had stopped a meter above his head, held in place by a shimmering field of blue-white energy. The strain of the effort was visible. Her light flickered violently, and the veins of starlight in her skin pulsed with a painful intensity. She was holding tons of wreckage aloft through sheer will. He scrambled out from under the deadly canopy. Lyra held the field for another second, then let it collapse with a deafening crash that shook the entire level. She stumbled, her light dimming. She had expended a tremendous amount of energy to save him, the first concrete act of mutual protection. He had given her a pellet of food. She had given him his life. The debt was settled, and a new understanding was forged in the dust and darkness. He grabbed her arm. Her skin was not skin at all, but a surface of cool, flowing energy, like touching liquid light. We have to keep moving. She steadied herself, giving a slow, deliberate nod. The bond was no longer one of convenience. It was one of survival. They were in this together, two fugitives against the might of the hegemony, with only the darkness and each other to rely on. Their escape from the facility was a blur of frantic movement through darkened, groaning corridors. They navigated the forgotten underbelly of the station, a maze of abandoned mine shafts and derelict storage bays from a century before. The air grew stale, thick with the dust of ages and the scent of decay. The pursuit was relentless, Thorne's forces always a few steps behind, their searchlights cutting swaths through the gloom, their voices echoing in the metallic labyrinth. Kalen pushed them onward, driven by a primal need to reach the surface, to feel an open sky above him, even the thin, toxic atmosphere of Xylos. Lyra, still weakened, followed his lead. Her light was a soft, pulsing glow, just enough to see by. She was the lantern, and he was the guide. This shared ordeal forged their reliance into something stronger. They moved as one entity, her silent grace complementing his grim, practiced efficiency. They finally emerged through a rusted ventilation port onto the planet's surface, into the heart of a perpetual twilight storm. The wind howled, carrying shards of black, volcanic glass that scoured any exposed surface. The landscape was a nightmare of jagged peaks and deep chasms, a world shattered and bled dry. There was no sun, only the distant, hazy glow of a nebula that painted the sky in bruised shades of purple and gray. It was a wasteland, but it was open. It was freedom. For weeks, they traveled through that desolate world, a shared journey through hell. They faced environmental hazards that tested the limits of Kalen's endurance. Corrosive acid rains forced them to seek shelter in deep, echoing caves. Unseen predators, things that had evolved in the planet's poisoned core, hunted them in the long nights. Kalen's survival skills kept them alive. He knew how to find pockets of filtered water seeping through ancient rock, how to track the movements of the planet's monstrous fauna, how to read the subtle shifts in the toxic winds. Lyra, in turn, protected them in ways he could not. She could sense the tremors of approaching rockslides long before they happened. Her light, when focused, could drive back the nocturnal creatures that stalked them. Their nonverbal communication deepened, becoming a language of shared glances, gestures, and feelings. He learned to read the subtle fluctuations in her light as she learned to interpret the tension in his shoulders or the set of his jaw. They were two halves of a single, desperate organism. One cycle, huddled for shelter from a particularly violent glass storm, they found refuge in a cavern that was different from the others. The walls were not bare rock, but were lined with massive, crystalline structures that pulsed with a faint, internal light, mirroring the glow from Lyra's own body. It felt like a sanctuary, a place of immense power and peace. As Lyra entered the cavern, the crystals brightened, resonating with her presence. She walked to the center of the chamber and placed a hand on the largest crystal, a pillar of translucent quartz that rose from the floor to the ceiling. The cavern was flooded with a soft, blue light. She turned her featureless face to Kalen and beckoned him closer. He approached cautiously and placed his own hand on the crystal, next to hers. The moment he made contact, his mind was torn from his body. He was no longer Kalen, the jaded warden. He was seeing the world through her eyes, through the planet's eyes. He saw a history that spanned millennia. He saw a young, vibrant world, teeming with life, a garden of impossible flora and fauna under the light of a brilliant, white star. He felt the planet's consciousness, a slow, vast, and benevolent awareness that was Lyra. She was not a creature from Xylos. She was Xylos. She was its heart, its mind, its soul, given form. Then he saw the arrival of the hegemony. He saw their great, sterile ships descending from the sky. He saw the drill, a monstrous machine that burrowed into the planet's core, not to mine inert minerals, but to tap directly into her life force. He felt the agony of that violation, a pain that was not merely physical but existential. The hegemony was not just mining a planet. They were murdering a god, slowly and for profit. The sterile landscape, the toxic storms, the dying world. It was all a result of their parasitic extraction. He saw Administrator Forlag, not on Xylos, but in a grand, sterile chamber before a hegemony tribunal. Forlag presented a document, an ancient, legalistic charter from a defunct galactic empire that granted his corporation salvaging rights to abandoned systems. He cited precedent, a long-forgotten law. The tribunal, corrupt and indifferent, had stamped the document. A gavel fell, and with that sound, Forlag was awarded the deed to a living world, a legal justification for his atrocity. The charge was trespassing. The verdict was death. The vision faded, leaving Kalen gasping on the cavern floor, the cold reality of the truth a shard of ice in his gut. This was not about resources. It was about consumption. It was about the complete and utter annihilation of life for the sake of power. He finally understood the stakes. He was no longer just a fugitive fighting for his own survival. He was a soldier in a war for the soul of a world. He looked at Lyra, who was watching him, her light soft and sorrowful. He saw the faint, dark lines on her body where the energy binders had held her, scars that were not just on her form, but on the planet itself. They were fault lines, fissures in the very bedrock of the world. He unconsciously reached up and touched the old scar tissue on his own cheek, a jagged line left by a plasma burn from a forgotten war. It was a mark of pain, a memory of violence. He and this celestial being were bound by their shared wounds, by the scars left upon them by a cruel and uncaring universe. In that moment of shared vulnerability, his purpose crystallized. He would not let this world die. He would not let her die. He would fight. The hegemony's pursuit did not cease. Forlag, enraged by the loss of his most valuable asset, had intensified the search. Drones swept the blasted plains, their optical sensors cutting through the gloom. Ground patrols and armored crawlers combed the canyons. Kalen knew it was only a matter of time before they were found. Their sanctuary in the crystal cavern could not last forever. The inevitable confrontation came in a valley of obsidian spires. A patrol of 3 heavy crawlers, led by Subcommander Thorn himself, cornered them. The vehicles were bristling with weaponry, their plasma cannons charging with a hungry, electric whine. Thorn's voice, amplified and distorted, boomed across the desolate landscape. Warden Kalen, you are charged with treason, sedition, and theft of hegemony property. Surrender the asset, and the administrator may grant you a swift execution. Kalen didn't bother to reply. He took cover behind a shard of black rock, his standard-issue pulse rifle feeling like a child's toy against the armored vehicles. He looked to Lyra. Her light was burning with a cold, white intensity he had never seen before. She was no longer the frightened, disoriented creature from the cell. She was a planet's wrath given form. As the crawlers opened fire, unleashing torrents of superheated plasma that vaporized the rock around them, Lyra acted. She raised her hands to the sky, and the ground began to tremble. The obsidian spires, monuments to the planet's violent past, groaned and shifted. With a sound like the world cracking open, she tore them from their foundations. Great spears of rock, each weighing hundreds of tons, lifted into the air and hung there for a moment, silhouetted against the bruised sky. Then, she sent them hurtling downward. They descended not with the random trajectory of a rock slide, but with the guided precision of missiles. The first crawler was crushed instantly, its armor crumpling like paper. The second was impaled, its reactor core detonating in a flash of green light. Thorn's crawler swerved, its cannons firing wildly. Lyra met the plasma bolts with a shield of pure force, the impacts exploding in silent bursts of light. She was magnificent, a being of primal power, wielding the very substance of her world as a weapon. But Kalen saw the cost. With every exertion of her power, her light flickered, and a deep tremor ran through the ground beneath his feet. The planet itself was groaning in agony. She was fighting with her own lifeblood, tearing pieces of herself away to defend them. He laid down suppressing fire, his pulse rifle hammering away at the crawler's optical sensors. Under the cover of Lyra's awesome display, he managed to disable its primary targeting array. Thorn, blinded and enraged, retreated, his crawler disappearing into the dust and gloom. They had won the battle, but as Kalen looked to the sky, he knew they could never win the war. Hanging in the upper atmosphere, like malevolent stars, were the warships of the hegemony fleet. A frigate and 2 destroyers, their silhouettes sharp against the nebula's glow. They had been observing, assessing. Thorne's ground patrol had been a probe. Now, Forlag knew where they were. He knew what Lyra was capable of. A direct military victory was impossible. They could defeat 1,000 crawlers, but they could do nothing against an orbital bombardment. The hegemony would simply sterilize the continent from space, willing to sacrifice the planet's surface to kill its heart and deny it to anyone else. The more Lyra fought, the more she revealed her power, the more she justified Forlag's decision to use overwhelming force. It was an unwinnable war, a perfect trap. Her every act of defiance was draining the very life she sought to protect, pushing them closer to a final, apocalyptic checkmate. The quiet that followed the battle was heavy with despair. They returned to the relative safety of the crystal cavern, the silence within its walls a stark contrast to the violence outside. Lyra's light was dim, her form less defined, as if she were becoming transparent. The effort had cost her dearly. The planet felt weaker, its deep, slow pulse fainter than before. Kalen paced the cavern, his mind racing, searching for a way out of the closing trap. There was no escape. They could not run, they could not hide, and they could not fight. Every path led to the same end, annihilation. Forlag held all the cards. The fleet in orbit was his final, unanswerable argument. As his hope dwindled, Lyra stirred. She moved to the central crystal pillar and once again placed her hand upon it. She beckoned to him. He knew what was coming. Another vision, another piece of the terrible truth. He hesitated, then placed his hand beside hers. The vision that flooded his mind was not of the past, but of a possible future, a solution so terrible it was barely a solution at all. He saw the hegemony's drill, the great machine at the heart of their facility, the conduit through which they were siphoning her life. The vision showed him its control room, a nexus of technology and power that regulated the flow of energy. He saw that the drill could be reversed. The parasitic flow could be stopped and turned back into a restorative one. But the process required more than just flipping a switch. The machine's control system was too complex, its energies too volatile for any simple override. It required a sentient mind to integrate with it, to act as a living regulator, a bridge between the machine's cold logic and the planet's living consciousness. He saw a figure step up to the control interface, placing its hands upon the console. He saw the figure engulfed in light, its body dissolving as its consciousness was drawn into the machine, into the planet's core, into Lyra herself. The individual would cease to exist, their identity, their very being, subsumed into the planetary matrix. They would become a new warden, not of a prison, but of a world's life force. A silent, eternal guardian, a living seal against the violation. The vision showed the result of this act. A wave of restorative energy would pulse from the planet, not a destructive blast, but a wave of pure life that would overload and disable the hegemony's technology without killing its soldiers. The fleet would be rendered inert, the drill shattered, the war ended in a single, silent moment. Peace, but at the cost of a soul. An impossible choice was presented. A sacrifice was required. The vision ended. Kalen stood trembling in the silent cavern, the weight of that knowledge pressing down on him. Lyra had not shown him this to command him. She had shown him because it was the only way. She could not do it herself. Her consciousness was the very thing that needed to be regulated. The choice had to be made by another. It had to be him. For a long time after the vision faded, Kalen did not move. He stood before the glowing crystal, the silence of the cavern pressing in on him. The choice laid before him was absolute. It was not a choice between victory and defeat, but between oblivion and a form of existence he could barely comprehend. To sacrifice not just his life, but his self. To have his consciousness, his memories, his very identity, unraveled and rewoven into the fabric of a world. He stepped away from the crystal and walked to the mouth of the cavern. He looked out at the desolate landscape of Xylos, at the jagged peaks and the sky of bruised violet. He had spent his life as a tool for a system he despised, his actions dictated by orders and protocols that served only the hegemony's endless hunger. His existence had been one of cynical survival, a long, weary march toward a quiet, meaningless end. He had no family, no home to return to, only a bank of credits and a collection of bitter memories. He thought of the men he had served with, the good soldiers who had died for causes they later learned were lies. He thought of the worlds he had helped pacify, worlds that were now just another asset in the hegemony's portfolio. His whole life had been spent serving death, in one form or another. Now, he was being offered a chance to serve life. To become a guardian, a protector in the truest sense of the word. To perform one final act that would give his entire, hollow existence a profound and lasting meaning. It was a terrifying prospect, the dissolution of the self. But what was his self-worth? A collection of scars and regrets. The alternative was to do nothing. To wait for the orbital bombardment that would scour this world clean, to watch Lyra be extinguished, to die in a flash of sterile plasma, his defiance ultimately meaningless. His death would be just another line item in a hegemony incident report. His internal deliberation was not a storm of emotion, but a cold, quiet calculus. He weighed his empty past against a purposeful end. He had been a warden of a cage. He could become the warden of a world. The symmetry of it was stark, and in its own way, beautiful. He made his choice. There was no grand pronouncement, no dramatic acceptance of his fate. It was a quiet, internal settling, a final alignment of purpose. He turned and walked back into the heart of the cavern, toward Lyra. She had not moved, her light pulsing with a soft, sorrowful rhythm. She knew the weight of what she had asked, what she had shown him. He walked to her, and, for the first time, reached out and gently touched her arm. The surface was like cool, flowing energy. He did not need words. She did not need to hear them. In that single, simple gesture, he communicated his decision, his acceptance, his commitment. A tremor of profound sorrow passed through her, a wave of palpable grief that washed over him. She understood. She raised her hand, her fingers of light hovering just before his face. For a moment, she hesitated, and in that hesitation, he felt the depth of her own sacrifice. She was asking him to die so that she might live, a bargain that caused her an agony deeper than any the hegemony's machines could inflict. Then, with infinite gentleness, she touched her fingers to his forehead. It was not a vision this time. It was a farewell, a blessing, a transference of gratitude and sorrow that was more eloquent than any spoken language. In that moment, he felt her promise. He would not be forgotten. His memory, his essence, would be preserved, a cherished part of the world he was saving. He gave a single, slow nod. His resolve was set. They had a plan. They had a destination. They had to return to the source of the world's pain, to the heart of the hegemony's facility, and confront the machine. It was a final journey back into the cage, not to escape it, but to transform it. The infiltration back into the facility was a descent into a familiar hell. The chaos of their escape had been replaced by the cold, ordered lockdown of a military occupation. Thorne's forces were everywhere, patrols marching through the corridors with brutal efficiency. The station was on high alert, a hornet's nest Kalen intended to kick one last time. They moved through the same service tunnels and forgotten shafts as before, but this time their purpose was different. They were not fleeing, they were advancing. Lyra's light was now shielded, a conscious act of suppression on her part to keep them hidden. She dimmed her own life force, wrapping them in a cloak of subtle energy that baffled the hegemony's sensors. Kalen led the way, his pulse rifle held at the ready, his movements silent and precise. Their target was the primary control center for the drill, located in the deepest part of the station, even deeper than the containment block where their journey had begun. It was the nerve center of the entire operation, and it would be the most heavily guarded place on Xylos. They fought only when they had to. A two-man patrol in a darkened conduit, dispatched with silent, brutal efficiency. A sensor grid in a primary junction, bypassed using Lyra's ability to manipulate energy fields. They were a ghost and a shadow, moving through the station's arteries toward its mechanical heart. The final approach to the control center was a wide, open causeway, spanning a cavernous chamber that housed the upper workings of the drill itself. The machine was a terrifying spectacle, a colossal pillar of dark metal and pulsing energy conduits that plunged deep into the planet's crust. The air hummed with its power, a sound of immense, grinding violence. The causeway was patrolled by heavy combat androids, their metallic shells impervious to his rifle fire. I'll draw their fire, Kalen murmured, his voice low. When I do, get to the door. Don't wait for me. Before Lyra could respond, he broke from cover, his rifle spitting a stream of pulse rounds that ricocheted harmlessly off the android's armor. It was a suicidal distraction, but it worked. The machines turned their attention to him, their heavy cannons swiveling in his direction. Lyra flowed across the causeway, a flicker of starlight in the gloom. She reached the blast door to the control room just as the androids opened fire on Kalen. He dove behind a support pillar, plasma bolts searing the air where he had been moments before. He watched as Lyra placed her hands on the door. It was a meter of solid titanium, sealed with magnetic locks that could withstand a tactical nuclear device. But it was still just metal, just technology. A wave of disruptive energy flowed from her, and the lock sparked, smoked, and failed. The door slid open. She looked back at him, a silent plea to follow. But a new figure had appeared, blocking her path. Subcommander Thorne stepped into the doorway, a heavy-bore plasma cannon in his hands, his face a mask of triumphant hatred. Nowhere left to run. Traitor, Thorne snarled. Lyra met his advance, her own light flaring into a defensive shield. Kalen knew this was his moment. While she held Thorne, he had to reach the console. He broke from cover, sprinting across the causeway, ignoring the androids that were now turning their fire back toward the control room. He burst into the chamber. It was a circular room, its walls covered in holographic displays showing the drill's status and the planet's dying energy signature. At its center was the master control interface, a raised dais with a console that glowed with a malevolent red light. Thorne and Lyra were locked in a struggle of wills near the door, her shield of light holding against the raw power of his cannon. Kalen vaulted onto the dais. He did not hesitate. He placed his hands flat on the cool, crystalline surface of the console. The pain was immediate and absolute. It was not the pain of flesh, but of the soul. His consciousness was seized, pulled from his body like a thread from a tapestry. He felt himself stretched thin, drawn down into the machine, into the bedrock, into the very heart of the world. He saw the entirety of the planet's history in a single, blinding flash, felt its millennia of slow, quiet existence, and its century of agonizing torment. He screamed, but he had no mouth. His body, still standing at the console, was now just an empty vessel, a conduit. On his command ship in orbit, Administrator Forlag watched the energy readings from the drill go off the scale, a surge of power so immense it defied all known physics. He saw the readouts from Kalen's biomonitor flatline, and in that instant, he understood the terrible, beautiful thing that was happening. He had been outmaneuvered not by tactics, but by sacrifice. Kalen's last human thought was not of himself, but of Lyra. He poured all of his will, all of his remaining identity, into a single, final command to the planetary matrix. Protect her. Heal her. He became the judge. The hegemony's crime was the charge. His sacrifice was the gavel. And the deed to the planet was awarded back to its rightful owner. A wave of energy erupted from the core of Xylos, channeled through the drill, through Kalen's vacant form, and out into the universe. It was not a wave of destruction, but of pure, unadulterated life. It was the color of the planet's dawn, a color no one had seen for 100 years. It washed over the facility, and every machine, every weapon, every light, simply ceased to function. Thorne's plasma cannon died in his hands. The combat androids froze in place, becoming inert statues. The wave expanded, silent and inexorable. It touched the hegemony fleet in orbit. Ship-wide power systems failed. Navigational computers went dark. Kinetic batteries fell silent. The entire fleet was rendered inert, dead in the water, a collection of helpless metal coffins adrift in the void. The war did not end in a blaze of glory. It did not end with a triumphant victory. It just stopped. In the control room, the body of Warden Kalen crumbled to dust, its purpose served. The drill, its stolen power turned against it, fractured and shattered, its great pillar collapsing into the chasm it had created. The fighting was over. The silence that fell was the most profound peace the world had known in a century. 10 years passed. The world once called Xylos was a world transformed. The perpetual storms had ceased, the toxic winds calmed. The bruised purple sky had slowly given way to a soft, azure blue. as a fledgling atmosphere began to coalesce. Where there had been only black, volcanic rock and glass, patches of strange, bioluminescent moss now grew, casting a gentle green and silver light across the landscape. Water, clean and pure, flowed in newly formed rivers, carving paths through the old, dead valleys. Life had returned. The hegemony was a shadow of its former self. The Xylos event had sent shockwaves through the galactic order. A fleet defeated without a single shot fired, a planet reclaimed by an unknown power. It was a blow from which their authority never recovered. Their corrupt system, built on exploitation, had crumbled. The former workers and prisoners left behind on Xylos, abandoned by their masters, had formed a new society. They were no longer miners and keepers, but settlers, living in cautious harmony with the waking world, a world they now called Kalen's Rest. In the heart of what was once the most desolate valley, a place where the hegemony's drill had torn the deepest wound, now stood a forest of crystalline trees. At its center was a single, massive pillar of living crystal, a structure that had grown from the ruins of the control room. It rose 100 meters into the air, its facets catching the light of the distant nebula and refracting it into 1,000 rainbows. The pillar pulsed with a slow, steady, and gentle light, a quiet and rhythmic beat that could be felt in the very soil. It was the new heart of the planet. It was Kalen. Lyra often came to this place. Her form was brighter now, more vibrant than ever before, her starlight veins shining with the renewed vitality of her world. She would stand before the great crystal for hours, a silent vigil. She would reach out and place her hand on its surface, and the light within would pulse a little brighter, a silent acknowledgement, a conversation beyond words. He was not the man she had known. His personality, his memories, were gone, subsumed into the vast consciousness of the planet. But his essence remained. His courage, his sacrifice, his final act of will, it was the bedrock of this new peace. He was the quiet strength in the soil, the patient resilience of the growing things, the silent, watchful guardian in the heart of the world. She stood there now, as the first true twilight in a century painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. She felt him not as a memory, but as a presence, an enduring peace that had cost everything. His sacrifice had not been forgotten. It was remembered in every new leaf, in every drop of clean water, in the silent, steady heartbeat of the crystal that was his memorial, his tomb, and his eternal throne. The world was at peace, a somber, beautiful peace bought with the soul of a single, disillusioned man who had remembered how to care.